listeners, I'm Sam with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of the Below the Radar B-Sides, our host Amjo Hall is joined by Ivana Filipovich, a Serbian-Canadian artist with a background in educational media, architecture, archaeology and design. Am and Ivana discuss her journey as an artist and her first graphic novel, What's Fear Got to Do With It? Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We have a very special guest. We have Ivana Filipovich with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Ivana, wondering if we can begin with you introducing yourself.
Yes, so I'm a Serbian-Canadian cartoonist. I came here in 1999 during the NATO bombing of former Yugoslavia. And I've been working at various jobs and for over 2 decades at Simon Fraser University in various capacities. One of my loves is illustration and comics. I was a cartoonist of some renown back home, but when I moved here, it sounded like the opportunities are getting scarce and cartooning was not as well paid as before. So I just focused on my professional career at the university and I dropped comics. And I then started again in 2017, and here we are.
Yeah, I want to, we'll eventually talk a little bit about the comic book scene, the comic scene here in Vancouver, particularly related to women comics and the scene here and a number of people you're in conversation with. But I want to begin with you talking a little bit about how you first got started in this.
So there is actually a pretty funny story. My father used to bring these junky comics home from work because he was confiscating them from night shift workers at the factory. And that's how I got introduced to comics. I would read all this, junk. And it was fun. I soon graduated to more interesting and, let's say, more literary comics. Thanks to the magazines, there were weekly magazines back home, and they had various European and American comics included. And I then got familiar with Hugo Pratt and Corto Maltese, and that, of course, opened my eyes to, doing proper research in comics, including history and details in comics that I haven't seen done in such a documentary way in comics before. So from then on, I was searching for comics that have literary value and finding them everywhere.
When you look at, like, say, Archie comics or something like this, there's a way that comics represent friendship in ways. I just completed a philosophy book with my collaborator on friendship and community, but wondering if you could speak to the comics that you were looking at and kind of their representations of friendship and what drew you into finding that interesting about them.
Yes, even these inexpensive Italian comics that we all used to read in former Yugoslavia by Donnelly Group, that were completely imaginary situations about North America, for example. The main attractiveness was really describing friendship and what people were willing to do for each other in terms of sacrificing themselves and fighting for each other, helping each other. And that's one of the, greatest values of those comics. So that still stands, although the comics are not as lofty as some other ones. This friendship component is very strong and very valuable.
Now, of course, in the North American context, we have certain ideas around histories of comics, or will be the gateway that people found themselves into, looking at whether it was Garfield or The Far Side or Mad Magazine or whatever. But from the former Yugoslavia, of course, having a very complex history in Central and Eastern Europe. What were some of the comic traditions that you were drawn to? Because they have their own rich histories, which oftentimes don't necessarily circulate into the North American context. But it'd be great if you could share a little bit about the historical context of what you were looking at the time, and also the kind of tradition that comes from the former Yugoslavia.
For sure. As you know, European scene is very, very strong. So we had access to a lot of Italian, French, and Belgian comics as well. And of course, American ones were always popular, starting with Disney and the first Mickey Mouse comics. And then at some point, we got a huge influx from Russia as well after the revolution. And those were professionals and artists, and they started doing comics in former Yugoslavia as well. And with that, there was a development in domestic comics too, with really blossoming around the student movement in the late 70s, early 80s. That's when I actually started reading some of the domestic comics that had huge influence on me. Those comics came mostly from Croatia. The authors first started working for student magazines, and then jumped into other more popular magazines and much bigger audience. And some of them are still active and continuing in that vein, and I keep following them. One is a designer, Mirko Ilić, who's actually in New York now. He's a celebrated designer whose series of posters called Tolerance is touring the world right now. He's finally back to comics. He started comics again during COVID, which I think a lot of us were happy to see. And then, of course, Igor Kordej, another Croatian author who has lived in Canada for a while, went back and now lives in Belgrade with his better part, who is also a cartoonist and a friend. So yes, a very developed domestic scene with quite a lot of happening. I was telling someone recently how I was mentioned in the news 50 times last year in Serbia, although I wasn't even there. And 50 times this year, I think, as well, because there's so many art shows and exhibitions and a lot of spaces in Belgrade. Belgrade has over 50 cultural spaces that exhibit art. And there is a lot of willingness to exhibit comics and illustration as well.
I'm wondering, as you were, coming of age and getting into comics and drawing yourself, what were some of the early work that you were doing? And also, I guess, to what extent did the Civil War impact your own practice, or what did it do to the comic scene in the former Yugoslavia?
As I think every author of comics can testify, we all start with megalomaniac ideas. First thing you want to create is something that's like hundreds of pages long, and creating a whole new world and stuff like that. And then you soon realize that that's a pretty big task, so you scale down. So I started thinking about what was actually upsetting me, because at a certain point I started getting uncomfortable feeling around comics because of sexist representations of women, themes that were kind of like constantly similar and repeating themselves. So I wanted something that's really contemporary life. And I started doing comics that actually had to do with regular people, with their struggles, and especially their drivers and psychology. So I had a chance to start publishing some of my work, and one of the first publishers was a literary magazine, which was a big boost to my confidence, of course. So while that was happening, of course, the situation in former Yugoslavia and the disintegration of the country was progressing really fast. And many outlets and media outlets, as well as weekly magazines, stopped production or couldn't pay the artists. So things started really disappearing. Opportunities were less and less. And in terms of subjects I was describing, I was stuck living with my parents, so I started describing my neighborhood and writing about my neighborhood. And those were some of the comics that actually got me into the famous Slovenian alternative magazine, Streetburger, which recently celebrated, I'm thinking, 30 years of existence. A big deal for an alternative magazine with comics, that's for sure.
Yeah, and in terms of the Civil War itself, how did that impact the comic scene? Obviously, there's a heavily loaded politics. You have a kind of unified nation state with the idea of Yugoslavia, and as it disintegrated, that there probably was the use of cartoons in various ways, from propaganda to other people doing subversive work to others, but how the pen was deployed, I suppose.
It was interesting actually comparing today's Serbia with Serbia back then. Milosevic, who was in power back then, didn't care much about comics, cartoons, independent media. He didn't think that those outlets would do him any harm. While the current atmosphere is quite different, and there are actual attacks on cartoonists, and recently an exhibition was attacked and destroyed in Zemun, which is the city that's connected to Belgrade. And that just tells you, while the old regime was really scary and was involved in a war, different powers are doing different things at different levels. Now, a common thing is to actually threaten people personally, tell them things like, I know where you live, for example. Stalk them on social media or around the city. We do have extremely good cartoonists who are still persevering in doing political work. I don't do as much of it. I had a book with a friend of mine who is still making comics, Vostok. Him and I actually made a comic about corruption during Milosevic's time. And that was not published in Serbia back then. It was a bit risky for publishers, so they published it in Slovenia. And it still exists, I think, in copies here and there.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the timing of your leaving Serbia and coming here in 1999, of course, the NATO bombing related to Kosovo. I remember being at protests here in front of the Vancouver art gallery where there was the anti-NATO bombing protesters, the progressive left out, and then there was the pro-Milosevic people who were against the NATO bombing. And so seemingly disparate politics, but and not necessarily in alignment with each other. So there was tensions within a protest happening at the same time. It was a very complex time, of course, and in terms of how Western interest gets deployed in particular ways. Can you describe a little bit of your arrival into Canada during that intense period of, the politics continuing to play out after the Civil War seemingly being over, but continuing, and the strangeness of coming to a place like Vancouver in particular?
Yes. I didn't have that much information about Vancouver because that was before the internet and computers were widely accessible. So I basically talked to a couple of people. I decided, instead of continuing with archaeology studies after completing architecture, to take my money and go to the Canadian embassy in Belgrade and apply for a self-financing immigrant visa. So I got the visa just before the bombing, but I was really sick. I had a really bad flu and couldn't travel. So I stayed there for the first couple of days of bombing. It was a really surreal feeling, I have to say. But you adjust right away. It's so strange. Humans are so adaptable that once you realize maybe the bombs are a bit far away from you, you start living a normal life. And people were, even in Belgrade, that was kind of like bombed almost constantly. People were walking around with targets on their heads and kind of saying, hit me right here in the head. There was humor. To survive, you have to use humor. So you had to do something, make fun of the whole situation that nobody expected to happen. And we also stopped protesting against Milosevic because you couldn't protest against the government when your country is being bombed. So it was just impossible to continue. And we all just like went back home.
Yeah, I was in Belgrade in 2002, and I remember going around with a cab driver, and he would point out a building that was still bombed, and he would say, a deposit from NATO. That was his humorous way of describing this.
Describing the situation, for sure.
Yeah. So speak to me a little bit about, how your cartooning practice shifted as you arrived here. Of course, in a diasporic context. I was living in the West End at the time, and so there was many Serbian refugees living in the West End because families would move into a one-bedroom apartment, 3-4 people, but people were used to living in apartments too, so it all worked out very well. I guess there's a big community out in Burnaby, of course, now, but there's no politics like diasporic politics. So you have people from different parts of the region living here, and so in some sense, some of those tensions remain depending on what era of the diaspora people come from, but also incredible solidarities that can be forged here that might not be possible there in quite the same way. But in terms of how your cartooning practice shifted as a result of the experience arriving in a place like here and entering into a new scene, I suppose, as well, in terms of finding other cartoonists too.
Well, I made some attempts to publish comics here, and I actually had an offer from Top Shelf, which is a respected company still in operation, interested in literary comics. So I put my stuff together. I had contacts who recommended that I get in touch with them, and I sent them my work. And then I got a letter, like a very, very nice letter saying, wow, this is amazing. Some of the best stuff we've ever read, and can you draw everything again in the same style? And I started, and then it was just too much work. I got a job, of course, having to support myself because I came here with just really a small amount of money and had to start working right away. And when you have a full-time job and you're trying to learn the language better and learn your new job as well, things like your hobby, really, because it wasn't going to support me, had to be on the back burner. So I kind of shelved it at that point after some attempt to publish here and realizing there are no magazines. Nothing for short stories, and I specialize in short stories, and access to big magazines that publish short comics is very narrow and only for the best of the best, like the top 1%. So it was really hard. And the scene is different. There wasn't so much cohesiveness like I experienced in Belgrade, for example. There was kind of like more, I guess, maybe capitalist view of things, kind of like, you do things on your own, you're an entrepreneur and you make your own future and your own success. While we, coming from a socialist country, had more kind of like, let's all get together and push the cart attitude to it, which it still actually survives to this day.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned some of your favorites or your influences, like Hugo Pratt, Paul Gillen, Mort Cinder. Wondering if you can speak just a little bit to how that work has influenced your own work.
Yeah, some of that work was amazingly different, like shockingly different. If you took a magazine, comic arts magazine, and started leafing through, there would be comics that just artistically were completely different. And since I have pretty good education in art history, I love arts. I also paint. I was aware of the sheer artistic quality of the work without even reading anything. And then once you start reading, you realize that the layer on top of it is also incredibly good quality. So that certainly did show me that you can be a true artist. You can work in comics, and that there are no limits. You don't have to be a commercial artist. You can be something different.
Now, of course, there's the visual side of the comic book form, but you also have to be quite Spartan specific or precise with the words that you use. And so, of course, there's literary influences that come into forms of storytelling, even in the comic book form. And wondering if you could speak a little bit to your literary influences.
Well, my major literary influence is Chekhov. I do have complete Chekhov at home. This is like a bunch of books bound in red leather. And I read it almost on repeat all the time, because I think Chekhov achieved something that not that many people are able to achieve, that the stories are still resonating with us today, because they're such good, psychologically well observed human stories, but also written with a level of sympathy and understanding. Of course, he was a doctor, and I think that did influence his writing as well. And I also know that he almost had no friends, because he would put every single friend in every situation in his stories. And that didn't go well.
Something like that. You just end up in a character.
That's right. It didn't go well with his friends. So, yeah, a lot of people do that. A lot of writers do that. Of course, there is just one life you're living, and that's your inspiration. You can only write from your own point of view.
Now, of course, like let's say the world of comedy, comics tends to be very kind of, there's a male dude component to the culture around this work, and of course lots of female cartoonists in Vancouver, and wondering if you can just speak to kind of the community of people who are working as cartoonists, and the particular challenges or opportunities of being part of a community of women who are doing comics here.
Yes, I think last year was probably one of the most successful years for female cartoonists in BC, with a number of female artists getting prestigious awards and achieving other success as well. We have Miriam Libicki, who is an award-winning cartoonist. She has an Inkpot Award, which is an award given to a person that has an outstanding achievement and is advancing the field of comics. And she's got that award for actually coming up with a new type of comic, which is an essay. And she's been very successful making those comics. Now she is involved in a project that is describing experiences of Jewish children in Holocaust and working with Holocaust survivors. And her book was recently selected by the German National Reading Program for the program, and is one of the best-selling books in Germany. So things like this are really incredibly difficult to achieve, and congratulations to her and the team, research team behind this project, which is ongoing. And then we have, for example, Pia Aguera, who lives in Vancouver as well, and was on the shortlist for a Pulitzer Prize. Again, there's so few women in editorial cartooning that even being on the shortlist is an amazing achievement. And I wish Pia all the best. She continues her efforts as an editorial cartoonist, and hopefully she'll end up with that award sometime soon. And then we have Emily Carrington, who published an important book called Our Little Secret. And that book talks about an incredibly difficult experience she had as a child. She was sexually abused. And it also talks about Canada's law system and justice system, and how it doesn't really support survivors, and talks about her problems trying to actually achieve some level of justice. So that book was also awarded Lindworth Prize, which is one of the North American highest prizes for cartooning. If you look at the list, the other winners are all world famous cartoonists. So I think having a concentration of that much quality locally is just an outstanding achievement. I hope we can better it, but I'm not sure when.
Yeah, and I think even nationally, Kate Beaton's book Ducks did
Absolutely.
remarkably well. She was just at the Vancouver Public Library, and I used her book in a class I was teaching. And a few years ago, Molly Crabapple came through town during the Indian Summer Festival. She's doing remarkable work. I think her new book is around the Jewish labor bund in Poland, and looking at the sort of progressive history of this group. But of course, she's done a lot of work in conflict zones and comic journalism, similar to Joe Sacco. But lots of amazing work happening out there. Really exciting as well that there's a number of people here in Vancouver, in particular. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the work that you're doing now.
Well, I am busy promoting my first graphic novel, published by a Canadian publisher, Conundrum Press. So Conundrum Press is a publisher that is keeping really high quality. Another publisher that's interested in publishing literary comics. So I was lucky to get introduced to Andy Brown, who is originally from Vancouver. And he offered me a contract to extend one of my short stories from my short story collection. And that book is now published, and it's called What's Fear Got to Do With It? What's Fear Got to Do With It is a short graphic novel that some call Pacific Northwest Noir. I would say it was kind of interesting to work with something that I created over 20 years ago, extended and actually switched it to this location instead of Belgrade, where it was originally envisioned. So it does. Since I live here, I kind of lost interest in that clubbing scene in Belgrade, and I wanted to work with something that's more Canadian. So this graphic novel happens in Richmond, at the Richmond Market, and in Vancouver, and it addresses some of the things that people have currently as focus. For example, one of the persons in the book is an influencer, social media influencer who is into fashion. Other folks have other goals. It's a pretty complicated story. In its essence, it is a love story, but it also is describing society and the way the society works, the way people are sometimes really focused on themselves and really selfish.
Are you primarily doing the work and the writing is is English, I'm presuming, in your more recent work. But I wonder, how do you think through the question of translation? Do you think differently from your mother tongue into English? How do these things speak to each other in a way? Because I think one of the challenges, I have a good friend who's writing short stories in English, but also, wants them to be read back home in a way that resonates and is very real there. And so how do you bridge that geographic, spatial, psychological divide in thinking about space and in telling stories and the mode of them?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing for people who change language, change culture and everything. Of course, my command of English language is not equal to my command of Serbian. But when I write, I do think in English. And then I translate into Serbian if I need to. The languages are so different. I find English very economical and very to the point, while Serbian has incredible richness, and you can almost speak nonsense to a Serbian person and they will still understand you somehow. It's just crazy. I don't know how to translate that into English. I'm not a translator. That's I realize now how difficult that job is, having to translate something of my own. So I do write in English now. I do have help from my friend who is an editor. We sometimes go back and forth, and I make my final choice. But yes, it's kind of like it's always an effort, and I'm not sure how people perceive my writing in English. That's another.
I guess
thing.
In some ways the visual form or the comic is also an active translation because it moves through language. You don't necessarily need to know the writing to understand the movement.
It supports the story, yeah. So there are both ends. But of course, if you're talking about literary comics, you want to be at that level.
Yeah, so I guess another question just around what makes a comic literary?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Doesn't have to be in my opinion, the level of writing does not have to be literary writing, but it can be. I think it's a combo, a combination of visuals and the actual story that makes it a literary comic more than anything else. That kind of quality that's needed for something that would, for example, do just as well in film. So it transcends the medium a bit.
Since we're out in art school at SFU, will be a number of students who listen to this interview. I wonder what your advice do you have to other cartoonists who are just getting started in the field, or whatever art form they might be taking up as a creative person who's had to juggle a professional life, moving countries to keep an artistic practice going, which is a victory unto itself.
Oh, thanks. I think I always surprise people when I say that most important is organizing and having a community versus draw a lot. I think draw, of course you need to draw a lot if you want to be a cartoonist, and you also have to do your research and find what's kind of like not represented enough. You don't want to be an artist that goes into a field that actually is saturated with certain type of comics. But honestly, going back to organizing, I think it's really important to have a community, to support that community, to share opportunities with that community, to push each other to be better. Because if we are all competing for that very small market, we need to be helpful to each other. And a friend of mine, Doug Savage, who is the creator of Savage Chickens, he always says, you see something nice, you say something nice, which is really eye-opening. Artists are very sensitive beings, and they need all the support that they can get. So that type of support goes a long way.
Yeah, I wish the people that worked with me said some nice things once in a while.
Maybe they'll learn
Yeah.
something.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Ivana?
I am involved in Serbia with a feminist group of cartoonists who are trying their best to actually stop the slippage into Middle Ages that is currently happening over there. We had something that happened to us recently, a magazine that's one of the longest running magazines in former Yugoslavia, which is for kids and anybody else as well. An entertaining magazine celebrated an anniversary of a famous comic, Hagar the Horrible, and invited only male artists to represent Hagar the Horrible. And
everybody knows Hagar the Horrible.
Oh, of course. And it's like, and that's a slap in your face when you think about how many women are in that same field, how many excellent illustrators we have. So we had, one person actually raise her voice first and say, how is it appropriate to have? And then, basically the response was even worse. The editor said, well, there were no worthy female cartoonists. And that just got us going. So something like that can actually be quite beneficial to people organizing and pushing back. So we now had multiple exhibitions. We had an anthology published. We won an award from a feminist organization. And I'm sure there are many, many other projects that will come out of this, kind of like a slight that happened in a major publication. It's not that this situation repeats in Canada. I think it's more around that comics are not so well represented in the media. We don't get the mentions, we don't get the exhibitions. We have festivals, but I would love to see more. Of course, you can always get more. You can get more attention. But one important component of how cartoonists get their living is actually selling original art. So exhibitions are a very, very strong component and needed component of our daily life.
Ivana, thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast originally created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. The Below the Radar B-sides are supported by Vancity Credit Union. Thanks for listening to this episode with Ivana Filipovich. Find out more about her work in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in.